haere mai, and welcome to Cult Chat, the podcast where we talk about coercion, control, and all things cultish. I'm Dr. Caroline Ansley. I'm a medical doctor. As a child, I lived at the Centrepoint community, a notorious cult in New Zealand, and now I run a website that advocates for the former children of the community.
I'm Liz Gregory, and I run the Gloriavale Leavers Support Trust, and I'm privileged to walk alongside people after leaving this group as they embark on their new lives.
And I'm Lindy Jacob. I'm a former member of the Exclusive Brethren, and I'm part of the Olive Leaf Network, a new initiative in Aotearoa to support leavers of high-demand religious groups.
Come with us as we unpack the cult playbook. We'll be talking to experts and leavers of coercively controlling groups, and we will call for Kiwis to cult-proof their lives.
Come with us as we traverse the cultiverse.
A warning, this podcast contains references to subjects and discussions which may be difficult for some people to hear. Please take care of yourselves and your whānau when listening.
Kia ora, ladies. We're back. It's lovely to see you both. What have you both been up to? Liz, let's start with you.
Oh, it's been such a big run of events with training, just the conferences, the events, the therapy training, going to Parliament, running events, and we had a big event in Timaru, and then we had one in Greymouth as well. And so it was all around understanding doctrines, beliefs of Gloriavale, how to be a good host or a helper or supporter, or how can therapists deliver really helpful therapy to former cult members. So it's all been around those concepts. So it's been incredibly intense, actually. So having all that just winding up, it's really worthwhile. It's been really worthwhile.
So you've been on this huge push to educate
Yes.
New Zealand, South Island,
Yes.
West Coast. Wow. Go warrior woman.
Yeah, I reckon.
And your
Amazing.
team.
Yeah, it's a great team. And what's amazing is people just putting their hand up saying, I'm really keen to be involved, and I'm taking some steps so that I can be really helpful and useful in the future. I find that really
Fabulous.
encouraging.
Yeah.
About Lindy.
Yeah, I've had a really interesting week. As you guys would have seen in the news, like the big thing that happened earlier in the week was the official government apologies from the Prime Minister and other key officials as part of following the recommendations from the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in State and Faith-Based Care. So that was one of the recommendations, that, a bunch of key people in positions of authority, while they may not be personally responsible for some of the abuse, some of them were really in their roles, but others, like Christopher Luxon, he wasn't necessarily the Prime Minister at the times of some of these abuses happening, but it's kind of that concept of somebody in a key role, in a key position of authority, who can kind of take responsibility for it and say, give an official apology. So that happened at Parliament, and it was really interesting. I went down, there were a bunch of, only a certain amount of people could go to Parliament to be present in terms of survivors or people who had contributed to the report, but around the country, and then at a great big shed in downtown Wellington, the Parliament event was being live streamed to people who had contributed to the report. So there were thousands of people up and down the country, and I went down to Shed 6 at the Wellington waterfront, as well as someone who'd contributed to the report, and so I was there with, I don't know, several hundred others. And it was quite fascinating, quite sobering, and quite unsettling, actually, because like the first thing I encountered was a bunch of people protesting outside Shed number 6 who were refusing to go in because they were like, this apology is completely hollow. And like one man said to me, if you go in there, you're going to need a vomit bucket, trust me. And I was like, what do you mean? Just to make sure I understood him. He's like, oh, it's going to make you sick, just, they're giving these hollow words and these hollow apologies when there's no action being taken and no real redress. And and then I went inside, and he was right. There was actually a lot of quite unhappy people in there, but
Mm.
people like me who kind of, from what I could see, wanted to give the event the recognition and the honor, wanted to give it a chance, wanted to go and listen to what did they have
Mm.
to say. The key officials like the police commissioner, head person representing Crown Law, like they did give, you know, you couldn't fault their apologies. They said the right things. They apologized. They said, we haven't heard you, we haven't responded well. But at times, the crowd was really angry, like in
Yeah.
particular, the woman there representing Crown Law, like when she said sorry,
Yeah.
someone in Parliament yelled out really loudly, and it came over the live stream saying, "No, you're not." And then the whole like Parliament audience erupted in applause and boos,
Yes.
and everybody in the shed that we were in responded with boos and clapping as well to
Mm.
that "No, you're not" statement. And she looked a bit scared, actually, that lady, but
Yeah,
just
I was watching live stream, and probably of all the apologies, I probably struggled the most with that one. I mean, she admitted that, really they hadn't seen the people behind the complaints. Their admission was that Crown Law had spent a lot of time and money defending the wrong groups. But I struggled with that because at the end of that week, there's the newspaper article about Gloria Vale, who's suing the Crown for their failure to respond to potential slavery inside Gloria Vale. And guess what the Crown are currently doing? Protecting themselves, where they're going to be held accountable. And so that was just a bit of a difficult one for me, the current outlook.
yeah, that was, yeah. So that was, Una Jagosi. Not sure if I'm
Mm.
saying her name right, but yeah, that sort of thing was quite challenging to, just the acknowledgement that actually for lots of people in the room, those words do sound incredibly hollow. Is it better than nothing to have someone like her say, we have not seen the people. Maybe it's better than nothing, but still, for the people whose lives have been, their harm has been added to, it's,
If
actually,
there's no change now, the harm has definitely been added to. If there is an apology and an about turn and a new way of doing things, it's much easier to accept.
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Mm.
so no, it was but then, there were a few survivors who had been chosen, given 5 minutes each to share, and they were really, really powerful. And at the same time, they didn't I was kind of wondering, have they picked some survivors who are just going to smarm along and be like, yeah, it's so great we're getting this apology, like, yeah, but actually they were really powerful with calling out stuff, like, they really clearly laid down the wedal or the challenge, saying things like, I'm reading here from one guy, and he said, "It is not enough to say sorry. As any good parent knows, it's what you do to heal the wounds of your actions,
Mm.
to make sure it never happens again, that really counts."
Mm.
And yeah, quite a few of them, Keith Whiffen, he said, "Prime Minister, you must hold churches and faith-based organisations to account," which, as someone who, I count myself a survivor of abuse in a faith-based care situation, there's been this whole dynamic where those in state-based care have been given the priority and the emphasis and more airtime, whereas there are so many of us who have, evidence proof of harm in faith-based care situations and pastoral care situations, and yet quite often this faith-based care just drops off and doesn't, get mentioned. But people like Keith Whiffen really called out the Prime Minister and others, saying, do not let the faith-based organisations off the hook. Under the guise of religious freedom and all that kind of thing, you must hold them to account. He said you must compel them to do what's right. So, that was kind of encouraging to hear those survivors, not challenging them to not let their words be hollow, not let them fall to the ground. And, there was lots of applause and cheers for those kinds of things as well. So, yeah.
Watch the space. Let's hope that there's some strong leadership that comes up that does keep things moving. Thanks for that, Lindy, and it's so great to hear what you've been up to, Liz. I've been interviewing our guest for today, Gina Catena, who I have come to know a little bit in the last 18 months, and we're going to talk a bit about why I wanted to interview her. And we need to sit back and just hear her story. Let's go. Welcome to Cult Chat. Today I'm talking to Gina Catena. Gina's a certified nurse midwife and a nurse practitioner in obstetrics and gynecology. She has a Master's of Science from the University of California in San Francisco. She also has a Bachelor of Arts in Art History and a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, which she earned simultaneously while raising 3 children and adapting to post-cult life. Gina has been practicing in obstetrics and gynecology with a busy, high-risk, diverse population near San Francisco for 26 years. In addition to her busy clinical practice, she also teaches trainee doctors and student midwives. Gina was raised in a cult group that has strong anti-medical ideology and beliefs. She left the group at the age of 30 with 3 children who were, themselves, born in the group. Gina began university studies at the age of 30 while raising 3 children, working and ultimately divorcing her husband, who remained partially in the cult mindset. Since her time in the group, Gina has done a full about-face, from initially demonising modern medicine to now, where she not only embraces modern medicine, but serves as clinical faculty for graduates from a prestigious medical school, the university where she trained. Gina has been a voluntary speaker, writer, contributor, and facilitator with the International Cultic Studies Association for the last 20 years. She's been a fierce advocate for second-generation adults, bringing to light issues and recovery needs of those who are born and raised in cultic groups. We're choosing not to name the group that Gina was raised in because our purpose today is not to focus on the group of origin. You could search her name online and learn about the group another time. Today, we're focusing upon the anti-medicine stance that is common to many cultic groups, regardless of how the group presents, whether it be wrapped in biblical, Buddhist, Hindu, New Age, political, or artistic coverings. In this first episode, we will explore Gina's mental process about healthcare and medicine within the group and the mental shifts that led to her departure. In the second episode, we'll explore the ongoing mental shifts through her medical training and how she interacts with patients in her clinical practice who may decline recommended treatment. At the end of both episodes, I'll be joined by Liz and Lindy, and we'll have a brief korero or chat about each conversation before signing off. Hi, Gina. It's lovely to be with you here today.
Hello, Caroline, Dr. Ansley. It's lovely to be with you. I'm so honored to be part of supporting your work in this way.
Well, it's been really great getting to know you. We met after I read a book that you were interviewed in, Steve Hassan's book, Combating Cult Mind Control. You were in that, and I reached out to you. Do you remember that?
I do, and I was so excited because the medical and health issues around people in cults, people leaving cults, have also been a pet concern of mine. And as you and I had discussed in another personal conversation, that I had tried to generate some interest about this a number of years ago, and it kind of fell flat. So when you approached me, I was so thrilled.
Yeah.
This is such a pet peeve. And it was lovely to meet you in Barcelona.
Yes, we did. We then connected in Barcelona at the conference.
Yeah. So,
Well, here we are having a proper chat about this whole thing. We can bring some of our ideas and experiences together and learn more about your history. So I think the best place to start is actually with your history in the group that you were raised into. So can you tell us about that?
So my parents were very young when they came to the US with their parents, and each of their extended families were back in the old country. So they did not have extended family in their own lives. As adults, post-World War II, so I'm dating myself since my parents were adults at that time, they each independently started working at the new United Nations, a global group, of course, dedicated to world peace. And that's how my parents met. They married. I was born as a UN kid initially. And there was this sense of extended family, global family, through their social network with the United Nations. So at some point when I was 8 or 9 years old, my father took a job. My father became an engineer. He took a job in Southern California on a US military base, civil service engineer. working in aerospace and weaponry. And my parents moved to this small town in the desert where military things are built. And even as a child, that was kind of a shocking change from being with this international group of people with the United Nations. So now we're in this small town. I went to a school where children of Hell's Angels, motorcycle gangs, and children of nuclear physicists were in the same school.
Mm.
My parents, I'm sure, had their own social adjustment along those lines. One of the military consultants to the base was named Walter Koch, and he was some type of a scientist, I don't know, but he was also very high up in the cult and close to the cult that they then joined, and close to a guru. And my father had some medical issues, rheumatoid arthritis. There was very little known about this back in the 60s. And Walter Koch told them that if they learned this meditation method and follow the teachings of this guru, it would solve everything. And my parents believed them, and they promptly drove to Beverly Hills, got initiated for, at that time, it was 2 weeks' salary. Now it's a few $1,000s, I believe. And then my brother and I were shortly thereafter initiated, and our home became like an ashram meditation center with the various scientists and their families coming to meditate and bringing in guest speakers. And that was the highest calling, the most important thing in life. The highest purpose would bring world peace. My mother was working on bringing this to the Pentagon. I actually have all these documents. I have boxes and boxes of old documents under my bed of all places. And they were also very anti-medical. Modern medicine was deemed to be, the word they used was tamastic. It's a Hindu group. So the group is a well-dressed up form of fundamental Hinduism. And so mainstream medicine was tamasic. They used herbs
Tamasic means what? Forbidden?
Tamasic meant like poisonous, toxic,
okay,
bad. Okay, so that's tamasic. Alternate word that was often used is ignorance versus we were sattvic, becoming increasingly more sattvic, which is pure and life-giving, because we had the knowledge, the special knowledge.
of course.
So there were meetings at our house several times a week. Their Saturdays were initiation day. Everything had to be quiet. And my brother and I, meanwhile, were attending public schools, which in retrospect was a godsend, because through that I had exposure to mainstream people. And even though I believed my parents, that my parents weren't consciously lying, they believed everything they were telling us. If you put them under a lie detector test, they would have passed, because they believed they were quasi-enlightened beings raising us up to be the same. And the best karma in life would be to be born into a family of yogis, which is what the definition was for my brother and I. The second best karma would be to be born into a wealthy family, so you would have the money to pursue enlightenment and become free of the material world and the earthly cycle of birth and death and karma. So everything was about living a sattvic life. Eat pure foods, becoming vegetarian, no smoking, no alcohol, no drugs, meditating for hours a day, staying very, very quiet. God forbid my brother and I should make too much noise. My mother would come out of meditation yelling at us to be quiet, because we're supposed to be quiet because it's meditation time. And at the time when everyone else was home eating dinner, kids on the block, our parents were meditating. So then after dinner, my brother and I couldn't go out and play with the other kids, because that's when we had dinner. My mother traveled a lot, months, anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months at a time with the guru for advanced training. So my brother and I were pretty much left on our own. Then we moved a bit. I enrolled myself in 6 different high schools because I felt I should finish high school. My mother wanted to send me to be with the guru in Switzerland. And I remember hiking in the hills in Santa Barbara above one of the cult compounds and thinking, but this is God. I don't want to wear a gold embroidered sari and sit in a palace with the guru. That just sounded so stifling. This was God being in nature.
Being in nature. So you
So
said you enrolled yourself in high school, and you also said that you were left alone a lot. Could you just sort of that to me sounds like considerable neglect, that you were left alone. And can you just sort of unpack that a little bit more, like the neglect of being left alone for months at a time, and also having your education left to your action rather than your parents supporting and enabling it?
I'm sorry that it's kind of hard to objectively look at what you just take for granted.
Yes.
For anybody, I think.
Mm.
So even my mother to this day, she's 93 years old. She's still as present as she ever was mentally. And she's very proud of the fact that she left us to raise ourselves because we turned out so well. So we were not guided in choosing our studies, our curriculum. My brother and I each dabbled in kind of rebellious types of activities because we weren't channeled into anything constructive, and kids with a lot of free time are vulnerable for sometimes not supportive forces. And as the group was beginning to establish centers, I was left to live with the group teen right after I turned 16. No one had custody of me, and I was going to the local high school, hanging out with folks in the cult. And of course, as a good-looking 16-year-old, was kind of vulnerable and ended up involved with someone 10 years older than me, a Vietnam veteran, who I later married and later divorced. It wasn't until I was 45, running a clinic on my own. My daughter, born from that relationship, was at university. And I was looking at a government grid on who to report of my patients' lives for statutory rape. And then I realized, oh, that was me. That was the result of statutory rape. Oh, well, she's in university now. It's a little late to report it. Next. I mean, normalize these things.
Everything was
Nobody in the group ever questioned it. If anything, people who were in their 20s were envious of me because I was this deemed, spiritual special person from this upbringing. And I had full family support to be involved. And these other people in their 20s, their families were not supportive of them. Fast forward, that group now has a much stronger community, a couple of communities in the world, and their own private school system, starting from preschool all the way through university. The kids, young adults who come out of that as second generation adults, have a much harder time integrating into the outside world.
Yes.
I was in public school.
Yes.
I was exposed to learning about the United States Constitution in 8th grade and making my little 4th grade report on California history and those sorts of things that are standard in the United States. California history if you're in California, 4th grade if you're in another state, something in that state.
Over time, that group became more kind of closed in a way, controlled education, particularly for children, a lot, which obviously controls members more over time.
Yes. And there still are satellite centers. So people do live so-called in the field, living elsewhere to bring in others and might dress and look like everybody else, much as somebody in Scientology or in any number of other groups, just walking to them at the grocery store, you wouldn't necessarily know. They don't stand out like somebody dressed from The Handmaid's Tale. But what the programming they're running on and how they're living and who they're able to interact with is very narrow, what Janja Lalich calls bounded choice.
Yeah.
And when I was a child, teenager, I used to babysit a lot for a family friend who, this couple was very involved in my parents' center. And I knew this woman had some challenges, mental challenges, and had been in a psychiatric hospital for some reason and was on medication. She was a lovely person. I enjoyed her. I liked babysitting for her kids. And one day my mother said she'd committed suicide.
Oh.
And this is dinner conversation.
Mm.
And I'm not laughing at the suicide. I'm
No,
laughing
the
at
casual normalness of it. Mm.
and that this woman was having enlightenment experiences, seeing things, hearing things, and her psychologist did not understand the spiritual. And this is the danger of seeking mainstream help, because mainstream doesn't understand the knowledge, the teachings. And if she had not been seeking mainstream help, then she wouldn't have had these problems and would not have committed suicide.
Okay, so that's how the group would frame her suicide, that the problem
Right.
was not the avoidance of medical care that she probably highly needed. The problem was actually that she was seeking medical care, and the seeking of the medical care harmed her and caused her to kill herself. Yeah. So that's how it
Exactly.
was framed in the group, so that their obligations towards her could not be addressed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because if anybody sought some mainstream therapy, they might think through things and solve some problems and not be as vulnerable.
Yeah.
Now, this is Gina saying this
Yeah.
in retrospect.
Yeah.
My father became, sadly, a real case study of rheumatoid arthritis untreated, becoming increasingly crippled over the years. Because as the field of immunology evolved and more was learned about it, there were therapies to help him. But he was so convinced that all of these therapies were evil, that this disease he had was his karma for past actions. He says, I must have been a really terrible person in a past life to have all this pain now.
Right.
And
He's ultimately responsible for it rather than the treatment of the group.
And for decades, he would say that he looked forward to dying so he could be born into a healthy body again.
It must have been very hard to watch.
It was hard to watch.
Mm.
Yeah. Oh gosh, he went on a 30-day water fast. They went on this fasting for purification to cleanse the stress and the toxins out of their body. And he looked like some of the pictures you see of people who came out of the concentration camps, because they were convinced that fasting would cleanse all the toxins that are causing the problems.
So, I'm just sort of thinking about moving some questions forward so we can learn a little bit about how you moved from being a child in this group for whom the ideology of the group was entirely normal, you said, and you didn't sort of have any ability, some, but not a lot, to reflect on what it was like for other people. And then somehow your mind frame moved over, because you eventually left when you're 30.
Oh, I got tired of people keep committing suicide.
You didn't choose to join. You weren't recruited. You were pulled in by your parents. And
I was pulled in. It's what I knew. Ended up married, had a child during a heated moment where my then husband yelling at me, had his fist in my face. I saw the car keys in the door and my 2-year-old child. I was 21. So I married at 18, had her at 19. I'm now 21. And I literally scooped the child, ran, grabbed the car keys, went out the door. Where to go? I wasn't living near my parents at the time, but The only friends I had were people with the local
The group.
center. And so went to some of them. They helped me get into a group home, a house where other cult members were living.
Right.
And paid rent. And I started cleaning houses for a living because I couldn't support my child on minimum wage, and I didn't know that there was a way to fund my going to university. So I cleaned houses.
So in the group, just to be clear, did you have an ability to earn money or get education while you were in the group?
Yes. Yeah. Most people had their own source of income, held a job or had a business or had family money. Some people did go on to full-time staff, living and working full-time for the cult, paid almost nothing beyond room and board. Others were very wealthy and would have the most prestigious, exalted positions because, of course, they could donate a lot of money to the group. Stanley Tools. Have you ever bought a screwdriver? It says Stanley Tools.
Oh,
The
no.
heir to Stanley Tools
Was in the group.
is pretty high up in the group.
Mm.
Gore-Tex, the
Interesting.
outerwear,
We have that
Gore
here.
family, others as well.
Mm.
So I knew those people
Mm.
and some famous celebrities who were part of the group.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you had once asked me about describe the typical day,
Yes.
but
Yes.
it really depended. You could be running a center out somewhere else. You could be a full-time staff member. If there was a full gamut, but basically you're supposed to meditate between 2 and 4 hours a day, preferably with a group, and that controls, what was their terminology? It controls the vibrations of the planet and directs the spiritual energy in a way that would bring on world peace, perfect weather, would raise the energy of the planet to bring us into Sat Yuga, which is bring heaven on earth.
Right.
And that was the highest mission you could do.
Mm.
But keeping yourself sattvic and pure involved a whole lifestyle of not only meditating, but having lights out, being asleep by 10 o'clock, of how you ate. They came out with their own types of medicinals that were unstudied Ayurvedic medicines with their own brand name on them.
And you needed to not take Western medicine, but rather to take their treatments. Yeah.
Right, all of which were very expensive. Including mystical gemstones that had magical powers, including paying for special prayer ceremonies. That I have some of the old order forms. You can pay up to $10,000 or $100,000 for these. My parents spent thousands and thousands of dollars on all of this. And my father's not stupid.
So there was a lot of different ways that you could access different kinds of treatments, which weren't evidence-based at all, and cost a lot of money, basically.
Right. And so
at the same time as discouraging or forbidding, did they forbid or did they discourage medical treatment?
It was strongly discouraged. There was stigma to going after mainstream medicine. So an example, one of my best friends who's died a while ago had some terrible headaches, and doing all of their special treatments and donating lots of money. She had a trust fund. She eventually donated it all to them, which gave her a lot of prestige till she ran out of money. But also trying to get rid of these terrible headaches. And but nothing was helping. So one day her grown son sees her in the local natural food store, and she doesn't know who he is. And she's wandering this place very confused. And he had the forethought to think, we need to get her to the hospital. So she ends up at a university hospital an hour away, has imaging, and like over half her skull cavity is taken over with brain cancer.
Yeah.
So there's not much you can do at that point. Like, you can only imagine how much pain she must have been in for years. Like anyone else would have been diagnosed long before.
Absolutely.
Right? So of course she died.
It's tragic.
Yeah. Her son had a lot of, that same young man had a lot of problems. Rebelliousness in the cult schools, got kicked out. Still started using street drugs, like a lot of the neglected kids. I mean, by the time we had a community, then you had a whole community of neglected children wandering the streets alone and creating their own challenges. Yes. A lot of substance abuse. And I remember the same friend of mine, this boy's mother, telling me very secretively that her brother had schizophrenia. But this was a very shameful thing. Anyway, so this young man ends up in one of the group's celibate monastic programs in another state. And my friend calls me and said, the telephone, says that her son had run away from the program. He felt like he was going crazy there. And it was January in New York. It was cold and icy, and he ran away barefoot a mile or two, got to a payphone before cell phone days, and called her collect. And she called the police, got him picked up. He was brought to a mental institution, diagnosed schizophrenic. He later committed suicide as well. Now these are good people.
Yeah.
Who should have been helped.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's more, and I could just start rambling off.
You could, lots of stories
like that. You don't need to hear them, but they're all tragic.
How did it affect you as a child? And I'm wondering how it then affected you as an adult to see all that healthcare neglect.
As an adult, that's why I wanted to leave.
Yeah.
Because these were good people and their problems were being labeled as it was their karma, or they were too pure to live in this world, so they needed to leave. There was no self-reflection about what caused this.
Exactly.
I remember being at a different memorial service. We did have memorial services. And I'm not going to tell that particular story of that death. It was a child. And I just put my arm around my daughter and held her close and thought, this is so wrong. I need to protect my children from this. And yet here I was living here, and I love these people. And as a young adult, I had chosen to stay with the group because as a single mom with a child, I had nowhere else to go. I didn't know I can get an education. Cleaning houses, I was going nowhere. And this was to have a community.
Yeah. And they were the only people you'd even know.
That was an appeal. That was an appeal. It was like as fun as being at summer camp in terms of anywhere you go, you see people you know. You hang out at the park with the small children. You have babysitting co-ops. Although some people just abandon their children, I tried not to do that. I'm not saying I never did. But I got tired of these needless deaths. There was a train that would come through town a couple times a day. Jumping in front of the train was the most popular means of suicide.
In the group you're part of, not just in the town.
In the group, yeah. I don't know that there was that much in the town.
Wow.
And when I would talk about it with people, with members, other members, they would say, well, every town has their problems. Yeah, but the whole point that we exist is we're supposed to be the solution to problems. Why are we having this?
Yeah. And no one was looking into the group and investigating the rates of suicide and the rates of mental illness and the rates of untreated rheumatoid arthritis and all these things. And it was all being justified as the person's fault. Yeah. Not the actual ideology or the it sounds like snake oil, a lot of these treatments.
Snake oil or cognitive dissonance of the fact that these things are not making sense. And that's a very painful thing to love people, but feel that what you're being told is completely wrong. That, the gaslighting, a term that's now commonly accepted.
Yeah.
When an entire community is gaslighting you, you have nobody to turn to. As a child, I only knew of that one woman and another man where I remember thinking, well, if they're having spiritual experiences and that's what comes, is insanity our goal? Like, that didn't make sense.
So we've only got a little bit of time left for this episode, and I was just wanting to see if we could just cover quickly how you ended up leaving and what that initial part of life looked like. And we'll cover the rest as we go on to the next episode.
Absolutely. So I had decided I wanted to leave by the time I was 25 or so. And at that time, I had 2 children. But I also knew that I couldn't support my children by myself. And I also knew that I did not know how to interact in the mainstream world. The way language is used, the way we think about ourselves. So it took another 5 years and having another child to convince my then husband to leave with me.
Oh, that's a long time.
Yeah, but you're kind of like in this fugue that time doesn't exist. I don't know how to explain it. And like, I was considered kind of not fully pure because I didn't go to the group meditations all the time the way I was supposed to. So when we left, we're actually homeless for a few months, just sort of staying at different people's homes. And my then husband came into some money, a small inheritance. So we lived off of that for a little while. And he wasn't able to function at all. He just literally played video games for about 12 or 14 hours a day.
Right.
So I got a job in a supermarket bagging groceries. And then when the supermarket manager wanted to put me on nights counting out the registers with him in some little office, I thought, this isn't a good thing. And got a job in a department store selling fine jewelry. I knew fine jewelry because in the group, I used to sell fine jewelry for their spiritual purposes.
Right.
So I could talk about quality pearls, but I could talk about how pearls would purify your energy, or crystal would attract the attention of the master, or what white coral did, or what sapphires did, and kind of talk people up into spending some of their money on the gem so I could get a commission and support my family.
Some of the those influence skills to good use post the cult.
So anyway, so I worked in the department store, and so by then I was 30, 3 small children, and one of my coworkers was attending the community college and transferring to university, and she also was older, had children, and I didn't know that I could begin university at that point. So she literally marched me over. I was afraid. She marched me over to community college. I registered. I really wanted to become a physician with the intention of showing the validity of all this natural stuff.
Oh,
And
you wanted to prove that it worked at that point, not disprove it.
I wanted to somehow do something in between. I wanted to prove that it worked, but also use mainstream medicine when appropriate.
Right. So you still had some of the ideas in your head, even though you'd left. And yes,
yeah. I still believed in reincarnation and astrology, but I didn't like psychics.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it makes sense.
No. You're just highlighting how leaving the group doesn't just end it all. You still have it there in
Right.
your head. And
Mhm.
you were on a journey to try to make sense of that. So I think we're going to have to come back and finish this in our second episode because we're starting to move into this change in your thinking around healthcare and some of the history that you'd grown up with and where it was taking you moving forward. And that's going to be really exciting to unpack.
Yeah,
And
the mainstream healthcare was really scary.
of course, it was. So I want to hear more about that in the second episode.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you for talking today, Gina. Lindy and Liz are going to join me and we're going to have a little bit of a chat about some of the stuff you've talked about, and then we'll settle in for a second episode with you in a bit. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Sounds great.
Bye. All right, welcome back. It's good to be back with you girls. You've heard that conversation I had with Gina, and I'm really curious to know what are the things that jumped out to you about our conversation.
She's a busy lady. She, like, all those degrees, that study, 3 children, like, is a remarkable woman.
Yes, I thought the same thing. She certainly sounds like she crams a lot into her life. And at the same time, sounds like she's got quite a gentle and calm manner. For me, one of the first things that stood out is, as you guys know, my background is in what I would call quite a fundamentalist Christian expression of religion, but she used that word to describe the group that she was raised in. She called them a fundamentalist Hindu religion. And yeah, I found that, that's just one of those things that kind of always still jumps out at me around how you can have kind of extreme expressions or versions of all kinds of different spiritualities or religions. And as she went on to describe, very similar things again to what I would describe about my upbringing, and this kind of almost total control of a person's life and lifestyle, right down to what you wear, the kinds of things you eat, your employment and education choices. For them, it was sleep as well, and how they spent their time. And it's like, oh wow, how fascinating, because that was under what she called a fundamentalist Hindu spirituality, which often, for me here in little New Zealand anyway, I don't tend to think of them as having extreme versions.
Of course not. And it's the cult with the wrapping paper, the different wrapping paper, the political ideology, the whatever. But at the end of the day, it's about the control and the control mechanisms that work across humanity, regardless of where you come from, what belief system you're in. The way our human brains are designed is that we can be dominated through certain techniques, and the impact on health. It's always incredible how these groups have the same ways and that they operate. And so I was really keen, and I know in episode 2 coming up, she really dives more deeply into the specific health impacts, which is something that we're always dealing with people who've left Gloriavale, for example.
But she did talk about neglect, and what I found interesting, there were 2 things that was interesting, is how she talked about neglect of the children and how she talked about the normalization of suicide. They were really, it was just, there was something about the way she communicated about both concepts that, I don't know how to say it, just felt normal. And I think for listeners, they may have heard something that sounded like it didn't matter in the way she communicated about both really serious and very troubling concepts. Children running around with no care in the world, her having to enroll herself in high schools, 6 different high schools, her mum wanting to send her to Switzerland to be at the feet of the guru instead of finishing education, a woman dying, a neighbour dying of suicide, and it just been mentioned in passing over the table in her household. Just these sort of like really shocking ideas, but talked about in a very kind of normal way. And I wanted to read a quote out to you that I never got to say in the interview because we never got round to it, but she was actually interviewed by Janja Lalich in Janja's book Escaping Utopia. And if you've read that book, you might not realize that you've heard a little bit Gina already, because she was one of the key narrators in that book. And in that book, this interview that she had with Yanyalala, she said, I grew up with people in the compound committing suicide and going psychotic around me. That was normalized. It wasn't until years later, after I left, when I was in a graduate school study group, that I learned that it wasn't normal. Some people were talking about some weird things that had happened to them. And I casually mentioned one kid who died and his skeleton was found in a cornfield. And someone got really upset and said, have you ever noticed that no matter what we say happened to us, dramatically, Gina can always outdo us? And literally, years and years later, was the first time I realized that most people don't grow up with that high percentage of psychosis and suicides happening around them.
Wow. Wow.
It's interesting.
It is interesting. It's interesting. It's that whole, it can come into that concept of someone who's left a cult becomes quite a compelling storyteller, and people latch on and their eyes just pop open. And yet the person is really just recounting experiences, like you say, with that. Yeah, I noticed it, that just that normalization. And it really took me back to so many conversations I have with leavers that on reflection, they say to me, oh, now that I think about it, I think I had a mental breakdown, or I had a psychotic episode, or, oh, that's what happened to so-and-so. And they'll tell all these stories of something that had happened, and no one in there cottoned on that they were in huge mental distress, despair, and this was psychosis.
Yeah.
It's
Really disturbing.
Yeah. And I've heard the same kind of non-shocking communication about sexual abuse from Centrepoint children, because it was just day-to-day normal. You could just talk about things that any other outsider would just don't know what to say, and they're just overwhelmed by the content, but they do it in a way that's really a bit like talking about going down to the supermarket and what did I choose in the supermarket. It's a really kind of matter of fact.
Yeah.
And that can be quite distressing in some ways to the listener, but actually it speaks to something very distressing about the experience. It was normal.
Someone can be so emotionally detached from something that actually should be very emotionally disturbing to be recounted and heard.
Yeah, it speaks to how serious that trauma was, actually.
She made a couple of comments that I wrote down, and one was this concept in these kind of groups, life just keeps going on, and there's so much to deal with and cope with that you barely have time to think. She said you're kind of in this fugue where time doesn't exist. It was just such an incredible concept, because it's something I hear a lot of. Like, people can't even put dates on events that happened. They struggle to name, what year it was, because in these groups, I think you're so exhausted. She talks about, and the whole community is gaslighting you. There's just so much going on everywhere in your head, all your experiences. Yeah, you're in a fugue where time doesn't exist.
I found it, this isn't directly, like, obviously we're going to keep unpacking a wee bit more about the kind of whole area of health impacts for people in these groups, but just a couple of other comments that I found really interesting, because I love this kind of thing. It just fascinates me, the kind of the psychology of the group. I think she talked about it being tamasic, like tamas meaning darkness and evil or contaminated. And then I think she said it sounded like Safik, but I've kind of tried to look the word up and I can't find it, so you guys might be able to enlighten me. But it was a Hindu word to mean being pure or enlightened or saved. And yeah, she talked about how everything was interpreted through these lenses. So whether it is food or alcohol or sleeping or meditating or not, or noise or not, as children, everything was, those were like the highest goals and values of the group, was to keep away the tamas and to seek the safik or whatever it was. My apologies. But yeah, I found that fascinating, because I guess it interests me in particular because of my own upbringing. The concept of keeping separate from evil and keeping pure was absolutely everything for us. Everything was interpreted through that particular lens. That's why we couldn't go to university. That's why we, couldn't eat food with other people, that kind of thing. So again, it was really fascinating hearing for me of this, huge international Hindu religion where those same concepts were such a driving force. And again, those are the things that directly then impacted her education, their views of the medical community, their health things. I think she said at one point, that the health impacts are a direct result of doctrine.
Yes.
And yeah, again, I'm like, wow, this is so fascinating, because again, for the, Kaz, you're the one from the medical community who can speak directly to that. But this whole thing of, you can't just talk to these people with logic and say, oh, you need a blood transfusion, because if their doctrine teaches them that the blood transfusion is tamas and darkness and contamination, you're going to freak the hell out of them to put that blood transfusion through them. And yeah, just like, what do we do with this stuff?
What it is an extreme application, because those concepts of light and dark, they exist in every kind of worldview, and yet there's an application that goes extreme with cult groups. And I think that's what we're probably going to look at in the next
we are.
number 2.
And in fact, she does talk about the transfusion example, so we'll hear more about her thinking about that. Time to move on for today and wrap up.
Thanks everyone for listening in. Make sure you like us on Cult Chat. We've got Facebook page, YouTube. Thanks to Plains FM for their support of the work we do. And
we've also got an email address, haven't we, Liz?
We've got an email address, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
info@cultchat.org.nz. I hope I've got that right.
Email us with your fantastic feedback. All right, make sure you listen to episode 2, and we'll see you again soon.
If anything in today's episode was difficult or upsetting for you and you would like to talk to somebody, we encourage our New Zealand listeners to free call or text 1737 for support from a trained counsellor. Or you might like to visit the resources section of the Olive Leaf Network website, where you can find a range of organisations and resources that might be able to support you. We would also like to remind you that the views and thoughts and opinions that have been expressed in this program are the speakers alone, and Cult Chat does not necessarily endorse or share them.